When I was in elementary school, I remember first learning about politics and how in the United States we have two main political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats. I took the two-party system for granted, but still wondered why we were limited to just two main political parties when other countries had multiple. How does a country with 330 million unique voices only have two political parties through which we are represented? And why is this system still around when only 38% of Americans believe that it adequately represents them? We may see this as a failure on the part of our two political parties, but in reality, our political system has failed us, and it must be improved to create a more representative government by allowing for more political parties. Today, I'd like to discuss why we have the two-party system in the United States and its shortcomings, and to provide another solution and its benefits. The two-party system that we see in the United States today is the result of our use of the first-past-the-post method of voting. Now, first-past-the-post elections are pretty straightforward. Different candidates representing different political parties are on the ballot, and voters simply choose the candidate that they would most like to win. To see how this works, let's take a look at a sample election and say that the results look something like this. In this sample election, we can see that candidate B would win the election with 40% of the vote, which is more than any of the other parties. We can also see that this election occurs in a single-member district, meaning that there is just one representative sent to the legislature from this district. This example highlights several problems with the first-past-the-post method of voting. First-past-the-post elections lead to strategic voting as well as wasted votes. So for example, let's say that you're a huge supporter of candidate D, who won 10% of the vote. Even though I consider myself a huge optimist, if you're voting for candidate D, you're practically throwing away your vote, as they have a very slim likelihood of winning. Because you wouldn't want to waste your vote, this may lead you to vote strategically, where you would vote for candidate A or candidate B instead, who won higher proportions of the vote. However, this is a problem because you're not voting for the candidate that you actually want. Another issue with the first-past-the-post system of voting is that in order for political parties to catch as many votes as possible, they often run the safest candidates, which frequently exclude women and minorities. In addition, first-past-the-post elections typically lead to a single party dominating the legislative agenda, meaning that they can force their laws to be passed without any support from the opposition party. First-past-the-post elections typically converge to a two-party system, which leads to a lot of polarization because issues are framed as either-or alternatives. So for example, voters must choose between whether they want to raise or lower taxes, whether they want gun control, or the freedom to bear arms, and a number of other issues when in reality, there's more than just two policy options for these topics. A voting system that addresses many of the negative aspects of first-past-the-post is called proportional representation. And today, I'd like to focus on the most common type called list proportional representation. List proportional representation is not a novel idea. 85 countries and territories around the world use a form of list proportional representation, and 9 out of the top 10 of the world's happiest countries, including Denmark, Costa Rica, and Norway, use a form of list proportional representation. There are many different variations of this system, but today I'd just like to focus on some general features. So to see how an election would play out in a list proportional representation system, let's revisit the sample election from our first-past-the-post system. This time, before the election even takes place, parties release lists of candidates that they would most like to represent them in the legislature, with their all-stars at the top and then going down the line. Voters then vote for political parties, though sometimes they can vote for individual candidates representing these political parties, and both methods are used in countries like Denmark. The single-member districts that we saw in our first-past-the-post system become multi-member districts in a proportional representation system, meaning that multiple representatives can be sent to the legislature in each election district. Seats in the legislature are allocated based on the percentage of the vote that a party or its candidates receives above a certain threshold amount, and this threshold can be made higher or lower by the government. So, for example, in Denmark, the threshold is 2%, whereas in Turkey, it's 10%. So in this sample election here, and the results are exactly the same, we can see that for Party 1, they won 30% of the vote, meaning that they crossed the threshold of 10% 3 times, so they would send the top 3 candidates on their list to the legislature. Now, there are several benefits to a proportional representation system of voting. Countries that use proportional representation have much higher voter turnout than countries that use first-past-the-post, as the need for strategic voting is greatly reduced and there are fewer wasted votes. So for example, in Denmark, voter turnout tends to be around 85%, whereas it has been around 55% in the United States in recent years. Furthermore, in all regions of the world, countries that use proportional representation do better than countries that use first past the post when it comes to the number of women elected. 15 of the top 20 countries, when it comes to the representation of women in government, use a form of list proportional representation, compared to the United States ranking of 128th globally. Because political parties can elect candidates with a lower threshold in a proportional representation system, this means that we can open the door for the opportunity to have multiple parties. Having multiple parties might allow groups like the Green Party to gain a foothold in the legislature in the United States, as well as opening up the door for creating a space for other groups, like a party of pro-life liberals, or a party of conservatives who emphasize climate change, or a host of other groups whose views would better fit that of the electorate. Voters could then support political parties because they align with their own unique set of beliefs, not just because one party is the lesser of two evils. Proportional representation systems also result in coalition governing, in which multiple parties must work together to pass legislation, since no one holds a majority of the seats. Coalition governing would mean that it's a great contrast from the first past the post system, where legislation often seesaws between the two main political parties, depending on who has control of the legislature. And there is an incentive not to compromise with the other party, as that can be seen as being disloyal to your own party. In proportional representation systems, there tends to be more stability due to a coalition government, where compromise is a prerequisite for passing legislation instead of an exception. Since proportional representation systems include almost all interests in the legislature, it offers a better hope that decisions will be made by a more inclusive and diverse cross-section of society, leading people to trust their government more. There are some key trade-offs to keep in mind when it comes to adopting a proportional representation system of government. Setting an appropriate threshold is key, as a lower threshold may allow more extremist groups to gain a foothold in government. In addition, election districts often become bigger in proportional representation systems in order to allow for multiple representatives, so your representative may not be from your immediate geographic area. It's important to keep these trade-offs in mind and to realize that the benefits of a proportional representation system address many of the negative aspects of the first past the post system. Sure, the idea of adding more political parties is all well and good, but how would we actually do this? That's an excellent question, and one with a simpler answer than you might think. It would not require a federal constitutional amendment to adopt proportional representation voting in the United States, as it could be adopted for state, local, and federal elections through state legislatures. Currently, the Fair Representation Act is pending in Congress, which would allow for proportional representation voting for the US House of Representatives. An act like this is a great start, and with sustained effort and collaboration, we can work together to move past our current form of democracy and form a more representative, more engaged, and more perfect union. Thank you.